Strange Clay, Ceramics in Contemporary Art, a large-scale group exhibition featuring 23 international artists, was at Hayward Gallery from October 2022 to January 2023. Out of the Kiln, From Technique to Concept, presents two artists from that exhibition, Angell and Serena Korda, in conversation with exhibition curator Lauson and Isabella Smith, deputy editor at Crafts. Together, they discuss working with ceramics and explore how their clays, glazes and firing techniques give form to their creative vision. This talk was presented in partnership with Crafts magazine and was recorded on November 26, 2022. The talk opens with some further background from Isabella Smith.
Tell you a little bit more about Crafts magazine, who we are and what we do. We're a magazine about contemporary craft. We've been published by the Crafts Council for the last 49 years. This year we've had a major redesign and reimagined what it is that we do. We're now a biannual publication with an events programme, and this is one of our events. So thank you so much to all of the Crafts members who've joined us here, and to those who will be listening to the audio recording at a later date. I should add that we've launched a membership scheme, and that if you would like to try the magazine before you commit, you can go to the Hayward Gallery shop, where you'll find our very beautiful autumn-winter issue with jade blades on the cover. So, apart from my role at Crafts, I'm also the author of a book on Lucy Ree, which just came out a couple of months ago with Ida Down Books. And I've been writing about ceramics for about the last 8 years or so. So it's really fantastic to be invited here to talk more about Strange Clay, which has to be the most significant exhibition about ceramic art in God knows how long. I should ask Cliff that. What do you reckon?
A long time. I'm joking. No. Last year, biennial.
So, I mean, I was working for Ceramic Review about 7 or so years ago, and I remember going to Frieze that year and just being amazed at the sheer quantity of ceramics of fairly kind of variable quality that had popped up seemingly out of nowhere. And since then, I think that presence of ceramics in the contemporary art world has never really gone away. So I think this exhibition is extremely timely, if not perhaps overdue. I'm surprised nobody's got there first, because it's such a rich and fascinating topic. And then, of course, you know, apart from the contemporary art world, we've also seen famously a proliferation of interest in pottery across the kind of reality TV world. We've seen it, people following pottery Instagram influencers who have literally millions of followers. Every ceramic artist is now also offering evening classes to meet demand. It's interesting to think about the different avenues in which ceramic art is making itself seen right now. And obviously, we're talking about contemporary art largely, but this kind of work has been made really for as long as humans have been making art. The kind of work that we'll see in the show, I don't know how many of you have already had a chance to see it. The oldest work is, I think, from the 70s. So it takes in some of those really key names from that period, like Ken Price and Ron Nagel and Betty Woodman and some of those greats, but brings us right up to the present with people who you may or may not be as familiar with. So today we're going to be talking about how artists use ceramics and thinking about the ways that they use clays, glazing, firing techniques, different surface textures and so on to give form to their creative visions, and to think about why choose clay of all the mediums. What are its kind of specific material qualities? What are the technical aspects that make it such a rich, fertile ground for contemporary art practice? So I'll start by putting you on the spot, Cliff, and ask why Strange Clay? Why the title Strange Clay?
Why clay? Why strange clay? For me, it really came out of a number of meetings with artists and watching over the past decade or even slightly longer, and a kind of resurgence and an interest in contemporary art for the medium of clay and ceramics, which otherwise have been proliferating in many other ways. And so it sort of started quite gradually, and like eventually, you log things and you track things and you kind of have ideas in the back burner and so forth. Eventually things reach a critical mass and it becomes, an interesting sort of thought experiment to think about if you could make a show then, what would that look like? There's a kind of momentum or a critical mass of ideas. Pre-COVID, in the sort of curatorial team here, we're talking about doing a show, and it was like, yeah, that seems like sort of current and on the mark in terms of ideas and what's happening in contemporary practice. But then, of course, pandemic for a couple of years and a lockdown. So the idea in the show was actually waylaid by a couple of years. And during that time, it sort of entered a bit of a slow burn. I think, by that I mean there were lots of conversations that then happened over Zoom, which you can imagine is quite challenging in terms of sculpture, because people are like holding their laptops up in the studio saying, "Look at my sculpture," and I'll walk you around it. And of course, you're not getting that tactile sense that all of the makers have, which is like intimate relationship between the medium and themselves. But the show was then set up for this slot, and that allowed just enough time coming out of lockdowns to make a number of studio visits with masks, and then eventually, for me, clay, ceramics, and this show, which is, as the subtitle suggests, about ceramics in contemporary art, was very much kind of observing and coming from artists themselves. And why strange? So, people don't necessarily make shows on painting, generally speaking, or video art,
Sure.
generally speaking. So as a sub-theme, it became very much about using ceramics in a surprising, in an inventive way that was possibly slightly disarming, possibly had tones of surrealism built into it. And of course, being presented in the Hayward, taking the opportunity to really work with and pushing against or being in dialogue with the architecture of the building, which is quite different from domestic settings that one often experiences either everyday ceramics or art.
Yeah. I think turning to Serena and Aaron, thinking about the choice of clay, Aaron, you work across medium. I'm aware, obviously, that ceramics come freighted with constraints. There's constraints on scale, there's constraints on firing, the myriad challenges of glaze chemistry. And that being the case, why do you both feel it's so important to choose that as your key medium of choice?
I think about it as the animistic qualities of it, the human, tactile qualities of it, and the fact that you are in a dialogue with it as when you're making. So you can push it and it'll say no, and you kind of just then can work backwards or work through those restrictions and embrace like the mistakes and the happy accidents and the things that go wrong. I think that's where I come at it from.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree. And I also think what kind of appealed to me about it was that you have to kind of produce a kind of studio setup around yourself that allows for the kind of production of objects of clay, and that kind of, for me, really became a kind of big part of it. Once you have that kind of setup, once you have the equipment, once you have a kind of facility or a kind of laboratory, it's actually then very, very cheap to make work with as well, and incredibly easy to overproduce, which is one of its biggest problems, I think. And the impossibility of recycling something that's finished but is terrible. You can turn it into hardcore, and that's about it. But yeah, it's limited. There's loads of things that clay can't do. There's loads of things people shouldn't try to make it do. I mean, this is one of the biggest challenges of running a residency program, which I've been doing for the last kind of 7 years or so. That program is kind of designed for artists who haven't worked with ceramics before. And the first thing that happens is people come in and try and make something that they've never seen before in ceramic, in a very basic sense, in terms of, something that's very long and thin or very solid and huge. And quite quickly you have to kind of check them on that.
There was a quote I really enjoyed from Amy Sherlock's excellent essay in the exhibition catalogue, where she quotes Joseph Albers, the Bauhaus turned Black Mountain College luminary, who said that clay was the medium that was most prone to the abuse by amateurs, or words to that effect. I probably got that quote wrong. There was something that you said, Serena, when we were chatting on Zoom before this meeting about the quote-unquote black box of the kiln. Could you tell the audience a bit about what you were saying there?
Oh, I guess I was thinking, well, I come from a background that is not, I'm not ceramic trained in any way, and I basically find a process I'm interested in. And I think my work is very process-led, so that's why ceramics sort of entertains my brain a lot. And I think if I wasn't prepared to sort of enter into that kind of laboratory or scientific almost investigation of the material, then it wouldn't be for me. But there's something about the magic and the alchemy that does occur when you close the lid on that kiln, whatever kiln it may be. But also, I didn't have a kiln up until 2021 myself, so I would go to other people and hire their kilns and jump on the back of someone else's firing. So it's sort of being open to whatever might happen. You can have a lot of control to a degree with the material prior to that point, and then when it goes in there. But yeah, it's about letting go and embracing the risk of what might happen to all those months of work. That can be a terrifying thing, but then it can be a wonderful thing of kind of accepting the flaws and the cracks and the imperfections and seeing them as the beauty in the work, embracing that and kind of going with it. I mean, for me, the firing isn't the end part of the process either. I guess there's a freedom to making sculpture with clay as opposed to being a studio potter, where, you know, the idea of like there being a break or crazing or all the problems that can happen with this process, they just either go in the bin or they become seconds, or I guess, yeah, that moment of opening the kiln isn't the end point. It can go back in the kiln as well, I guess, for further firings and overglazes and all sorts of things. So it is a magic box, and I think the minute you sort of open up to that possibility of mistakes happening and embracing that, it kind of takes some of the edge off of that moment.
What would you say, Aaron, the role of chance is in your work? Has that played a part, or are you more of the school of precision?
I think the longer you go with it, the more predictable you want things to be. My sculpture's been moving towards kind of long-form wood firing for a few years. And that's a bit different because you start to use that kiln as a kind of painting mechanism in itself, and it becomes much more about body selection and the stack itself, and even kind of fuel wood and things like that, which I think is interesting. It stops it being that total kind of black box system in a way. I mean, things come out of the gas kiln which are horrible all the time, and unexpectedly so. There's an unpredictability in that. I actually find that a more empirical process because of how those are fired and what you're kind of doing to them. And there's also a much more limited set of materials which go into a firing like that as well.
Can we do a bit of a definition of terms here? So can you just quickly describe in more layman's terms what you've just said about the anagama and the stack and the body?
An anagama kiln is a medieval kiln design, incredibly inefficient. But that's like, it's kind of part of it. It's a monodirectional fire as well, so you kind of have a gradient of heat work from the kind of front to the back and a gradient of firing effects. Fired for anything between 3 days and 3 weeks.
It's an incredibly poetic way of firing, as far as I'm concerned. There's maybe nothing more enchanting than anagama firing for me. But one of those things that makes that so interesting is the role of chance to me, because the way that the ash is something that you can, to a degree, control, but you still rely so much on the currents of air and where the ash will land on the clay and how it will vitrify and how it will create this kind of natural semi-accidental glaze is kind of an endless marvel, I think.
But it's interesting because I work with an electric kiln. I've never worked in this way, but I've got a friend that digs earth from rivers, and she makes these things. And from looking or seeing them on Instagram and following people that use them, they seem like real beasts in a way that you're kind of feeding them, and you really have to kind of tend to them for days.
Yeah, you have to kind of write like a bit of a military camp as well, which is fun. Again, it's like there's this surrounding which isn't the work, which I think is quite kind of interesting. It gives it's a context of making, which is very hard to keep private. It is very hard to not run anagama firings in a communal way. Almost impossible, actually.
Yeah, it's essentially like the exact opposite of the trope of the noble artist alone in their studio having genius ideas out of nowhere. You have to have a team of people working in coordination together to keep this thing burning for 16 days, whatever it might be. Although I remember I had a chat with the anagama firing potter, Nancy Fuller. She's in rural Scotland, and she said that when she trained in Japan, the women potters there who weren't accepted as part of Japan's very still patriarchal pottery systems, they would do solo firings, which I thought was absolutely insane. So they would set themselves alarms so they would sleep for 20 minutes, and then their alarm would go off, and they'd check the fire, and then they'd sleep for 20 minutes. Yeah. I think that's a recipe for disaster, but quite impressive. Cliff, I believe there's 23 artists in the show. You must have had a lot of conversations about chance and where that can take you, and the pleasures and perils of that. Are there any kind of notable highlights that stand out for you when thinking about that particular quality of ceramic art?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an overarching frame, the fact that it's a ceramic show, because there's lots of artists also working in unfired clay. And so the one of the parameters of the show is on ceramics. So there's a kind of, a study or a kind of thread that runs through it about different aspects of chance and working with kilns and firings of all different shapes, sizes, and techniques. I think, ranging from, visiting Serena with her setup sort of off the side of her home, to David Zinke, who created the squid in ink, who works in a sort of warehouse factory in Berlin, and it's one of those industrial-sized kilns, so there's a forklift that sort of puts the pallet in, and you can walk into the kiln, which is a bit scary. But, a full range. And then, of course, as Aaron was speaking, in some of Aaron's anagama work in the show. So a whole variety of things. And I didn't want to overbake the surrealist aspect of chance, in terms of the function that kind of performs. But I think as one goes through each of the artists, they're all different takes to ideas on chance and accepting that or not, and ideas about perfection or not. There's a tendency towards to just work with it, but also I think as one, and maybe as Aaron was hinting there, as artists sort of are increasingly comfortable with what they're trying to do with the medium and how that sort of behaves or doesn't in the kiln, then it becomes predictable and sometimes repeatable. So just coming off the top of my head, Rachel Kneebone's work in porcelain, which is quite dramatic for the use of that particular material, over years, possibly decades, has refined understanding exactly how the material sags. So in order to obtain the final organic feel of it, the kind of fleshy feel of porcelain, knows the thickness, knows when to support and when not to support, so that through firing it either collapses intentionally or doesn't. And it's not to say it knocks out chance, but she's learned to work with the behavior of the process.
Mm-mm. I just noticed as you were speaking that we've got a detail of Serena's piece from the show on the screen, so perhaps we should take the opportunity to talk a bit more about that, because it's such a richly detailed, fascinating object. Could you tell us more about this piece? Yeah. I think it's 15 metres long?
14
metres
last
long.
Count, but it could sort of shift and change depending on where it appears and the spaces it's in. This piece really was born through lockdown. I set my studio up that's down the side of my house that Cliff came to see. My work really shifted from being very participatory. I was making things people could sing into that were made of ceramics, so witches' bottles. So there's a lot of witchcraft and spell making in my work. But this was really the beginning of a kind of world-building exercise for me, of like a storytelling narrative that is continuing through my work to present day, which is just deeply imaginative, and kind of each bead became the bead of a giant necklace for a imagined mermaid. And I guess currently I'm sort of rethinking these sort of females that are present in our collective unconscious, rethinking what their role is, and how they've been kind of embedded in us and their ideas, but could they be seen in a slightly different way? So this is for a giant mermaid, I guess. It was initially shown in Naples, so Parthenope was in my head. So she's the Napoli, the symbol that's everywhere of a mermaid. But the story that I read, but there are obviously thousands of stories, but the story I read that she was sort of this unrequited love of Odysseus, and she kind of cried herself the tears that became the Amalfi Coast. So that idea of tears and grief was in the work. There's an emblem that's recurrent on a lot of the beads, which is a kind of slip trailing of a tear. So there was this sort of sense of an abjectness sort of occurring, but then I was thinking about grief a lot, and the sort of collective grief that we were all kind of experiencing and coming through lockdowns and COVID. So that definitely had an impact on the work. It was built over a 4-month period, kind of every day, and making these beads and setting intentions as I was making them as well. So there's a little bit of spell making in there.
I'd encourage anyone who's yet to visit the show to pay close attention to each individual bead, because each one is completely different and each one is a kind of a sculpture onto its own. There's a lot of cast fingers that kind of protrude.
I do a lot of casting. It's kind of now become, I've been sculpting a lot, but it's what I find interesting is how when you make a press mould or you cast something, how when you're repeating the like that quality of being able to make a multiple from a mould, I find really enjoyable what you lose in the detail, in a way, like each time you make it or each time it comes out, and how you can manipulate that you can make a lot of them, but then manipulate them and make them do different things. The idea that it's been dredged into the sea and it's been dredged out for the show kind of is what I was hoping for. So I was working with oxides and trying to get this rusty kind of quality to things. So I guess I work conceptually, but in a way, but the process drives that concept. So it's always like a symbiotic thing of like the two things, or the process leads me to be able to express the idea or the sentiment or the feeling behind the work.
Yeah, I think that phrase that you just said, the process drives the concept, is really, really interesting. And the way that you've chosen to use slip trailing for those droplets is, you know, there isn't a better technique to convey a tear than a drop of slip trailing. So it's it's an amazingly kind of appropriate use of concept and the clay coming together to express one another. So Aaron, we've had your images looping while Serena was talking. So let's talk a bit about that with regards to your work and the way that you use a lot of the classic Anglo-Japanese glazes.
I've been moving away from glazing with the kind of sculpture. Very interested in Iga ware and have been for several years. Iga yaki and shigaraki yaki, which are two classical kind of medieval Japanese types of pottery from basically from kind of neighbouring valleys. But this they're both these kind of styles of pottery which developed for the tea ceremony in the kind of Momoyama period. And what was happening was there was a real taste at that time for these authentically kind of rusticated tea bowls and hana-ire flower vases, which were kind of from the 11th century, 12th century. It had a kind of patina of time about them. They were very loosely made because they came from a kind of mass production context. And what happened in the Momoyama period is the tea masters kind of pressed regional potters in kind of kiln contexts in the middle of Japan into producing highly rusticated work for the tea ceremony, but in a way where it was really kind of pushed to its limit. In the case of Iga in particular, extended wood firings, deliberate breakages, deliberate kind of reconsecrating of different pieces from different cups into one cup. And just aesthetically, as an idea, I think it was miles ahead of its time in terms of what was going on in the West. I actually think it's really camp. I don't think that's kind of spoken about a lot. I mean, it comes from a serious context, which kind of overlaps with Zen Buddhism at times as well, but generally speaking, it was for kind of secular pleasure. It's this kind of mindset you fall into. I don't really know what to call that, but that's just where I am.
I think it's interesting to think here about one of the other artists in the show whose work is not that this is by any means a measure of quality, but although it happens to be a very high quality, but probably the most photographed work in the whole show is got to be Takuro Kuwata's pieces, I would say. They're on the exhibition poster. They're incredibly charismatic, striking objects, you know, gloopy, psychedelic, dripping, cracking, brightly coloured, metallic. They've got it all. They are extremely camp, to borrow that.
Yeah. No, he's
he's
taking
brilliant.
It further.
And, he's taking it to another level. But he's interestingly drawing from the same roots, right? He takes a lot of those traditional techniques and just kind of turns up the volume.
Yeah, he looks at the kind of chawan and the large chawan in particular, and makes that even larger. But yeah, no, I think taco is really interesting, kind of working within and without tradition.
Yeah.
His work was shown, the big show, at a Zen monastery at some point in the last few years. And I thought that was a very interesting kind of confirmation of his status within in the world of teaware, really.
That makes me think about that ceramics obviously has incredibly ancient history, and some artists work with almost no regard for that context, and others find it impossible to escape, and there's a whole spectrum in between. I think it's Magdalena Dundo is quoted in the catalogue as saying, you have to know the tradition in order to subvert it. It's quite visible in the show when people are talking within traditions and when people aren't, I found. It'd be interesting to hear how you both as artists experience that weight of history. Is it baggage, or is it...
I get drawn in by different processes, and I think you get excited when you see something in like the V&A, that you, like agate ware, like one example I can think of, or Nerikomi. I may be pronouncing that incorrectly, so you can correct me, but that's when you stain bodies of clay and you sort of put them together and you slice through them, and it's not about the surface glaze, it's about the body of the material itself being the decoration. And I became really fascinated by that, and that drove how I made these giant sound dishes that I made for the Baltic show back in 2018 called Missing Time. So every time I'm doing something, there's always something I want to learn about when I'm making. That's definitely how I feel when I make. I kind of want to go on a learning curve. There's something about coming out of your comfort zone, and it's just such an enormous history with ceramics. It's like never ending. That's what sort of drives you, I think, a lot of the time. What drives me. And like another piece I can think of where I wanted the ping of porcelain, because I was making a lot of sound works using ceramics. So I made these mushroom bells, as you do. But, I'd never slip cast. I'd never worked with porcelain before. So you are learning each time, like a new clay body, a new approach to making that sort of adds to that conceptual element of what you're doing. For me, it does.
Cliff, when people are seeing the show, do you think that something is lost if they're coming to it with zero context, or how do you think that plays into the visitor experience? Because obviously a major exhibition like this can't solely be for kind of ceramics aficionados, it has to be for general audience. How is that presence or absence of history felt, do you think, by the general viewer?
I hope that, and as part of the aim was that audiences and viewers from any background can enter the show, and that there's lots of layers of information that are accessible if you are inclined to know, if you want to find out. It sort of breaks down into there being different sort of groups. So you mentioned Magdalene, but of course Edmund is another one. I mean, Tokoru is actually another one who hold with them the histories of like studio practice or ceramic clay practice from traditions that they themselves have been steeped in. But as a show kind of about strangeness, much of the interest of their work has been about the turn and what they've done sort of against that or subverting those traditions or histories. You sort of encounter something and you feel a kind of connection in viewing it or an experience in viewing, but then hopefully that sort of opens a door to then understanding or going to find out a bit more about the background that those artists sort of are bringing to their practices. As Serena said, a number of them, have come from actually different art trajectories and brought those sort of skills and histories into their working with clay ceramics. And so I kind of feel as though within the show, histories of clay and ceramics sit alongside other histories, and those include personal histories or histories from other media or different art histories or global histories or different narratives. And so those things kind of all sit maybe on a level and are mixed and remixed depending on which artist's work you're looking at.
I'm reminded here of Aaron's kind of often cited aim when you first set up Troytown Art Pottery back in, 2014? To make it a vessel-free space that you
his
I get pulled up on that increasingly. No.
Yeah.
It's on your business card now.
Not anymore. So what was the question?
Talk to us about that, about choosing to make ceramic sculpture outside of ceramic history, constraints, pottery, etc.
I think at the time, I've always liked pots, I've always collected pots, but I wanted to see what it looked like to set up a sculpture-specific ceramic studio. We tumbled into becoming a normal pottery over the years, and now, yeah, we make a hell of a lot of pots. It was about keeping potters out. And other studios were kind of starting to emerge in London, which were much more kind of gym membershipy sort of space for makers. I'm not being critical. Like this is how people make work. I just wanted to do something a bit different, and it was also the context I was coming from as an artist was that I knew artists, and I knew sculptors, I knew painters. I wanted to see what it was like to kind of make an environment for them where it was not really about what they could do for ceramics, but what ceramics could do for them, in the sense that every ceramic studio is a very specific material kind of context. It's very hard to do everything at once, so it's about, what can this setup do for that kind of artist.
For me, Camden Art Centre and Jenny Lomax really was that person. But no, I think for a lot of artists in the show, Jonathan Baldock, Emma Hart, me, Salvatore, a lot of people, Jenny is just this warm, brilliant person in the art world, and she said, "I've got a kiln, come use it." It's like I was lucky to have that, because I think I was put off by the very good description of the sort of gym membership. If you have a certain space on a shelf that you can fill, and I mean, I've shared kilns, I understand that, and I like the communal nature of a studio, but that can be very limiting. I think when you have like bigger ideas of how you want to make something.
It's also just about kind of trying to sort of shift the focus on clay to say that it's just sculpture. Like it's kind of, if it's just another kind of material, that something shouldn't be interesting because it's made of ceramic. You can kind of get into it, and then it can kind of be technical and can kind of reveal itself, but it still has to be, a good piece of sculpture.
It's interesting to think about where process sits versus the idea, what comes first, chicken or the egg, that kind of thing. Because for people like Ken Price and Ron Nagel, who were working in California in the context where they were drawing inspiration from things like car modification and surfer culture and like surferboard surfaces and that kind of thing, what comes first? Is it the idea? Is it the fact of this multi-medium process? I was quite tickled by David Zinke's piece, which is, I forget the name of, but it's essentially a series of about 100 or so glazed test tiles in a row. I think it's called All My Colours. All My Colours,
right,
yeah. I was like, that is a perfect mid-ground between process and concept kind of meeting. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that. Where is the chicken? Where is the egg?
For All My Colours, it was one of the reasons for including it. I think it's something that if you're a maker is deeply familiar. Like I have that in my studio, maybe not in sort of such nice forms, but it does really point to process. But in particular for David, came at a moment where he was endlessly searching for a way of representing the aquatic and trying to nail a number of different glazes, which would just really give you that sort of wet slime sort of feel to things. I mean, process and material is an interesting one in that, yes, there's Nagel and Price, sort of a little bit of that historical conversation. And I mean, what was happening in the West Coast at that time, because there's other artists making work out of plastics, and it's just a kind of explosion of experimenting with different materials. But then you sort of thread it through to a contemporary artist like Lindsay Mendick. It was a new commission for the show, so it didn't exist before, but in concept, in the lead up to the show, be trying to explain to people that it's a sort of broken down, deconstructed house in miniature, and there's a staircase and a sofa with the back torn out. It's all these things which are not clay ceramics. But of course, once you see it, that's absolutely sort of key to her making, and what, part of that sort of scene setting, the mise en scène, is about putting all those different elements together beyond clay ceramics.
Something about knowledge sharing as well, which is interesting there, because the knowledge of a specific, how to unlock a specific surface effect, it's a kind of an alchemical world that you can dive headfirst into and sort of never emerge again. But I think it's quite interesting how that is such a communal area that you were talking about Camden Art Centre and their technician there, Serena, and the sharing of knowledge, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has their person that sort of leads you through. Perhaps it's not just ceramics, but for me it was ceramics, and it was Dan Stafford, who was technician at Camden for about 20 years, and just came with a real generosity of spirit of kind of sharing his knowledge. As a teacher, I mean, that is there, but there's also secrecy, because people spend years and years sort of developing a technique. You know, we were talking to Salvatore, I think, at the press open, and he was like, well, I'm going off to Hungary to work with a guy, and because I like what he does, and he's been doing it for years, and I think you asked him what it was, and he said, I don't even know what it is, really, the process.
Some kind
of
of like Bohemian glass-making thing.
But he said it's top
ceramics.
secret. And you just have to go there to like learn the dark arts. So he's willing to like let you in the studio, and probably you have to, I don't know, sign something so you won't tell anyone else. I don't know.
More spells.
But yeah, more spells. But
There's a few secrets left, but not many. I mean, and I think that's only sort of 10 years old or so, that it's really become quite democratized. That's why everyone's work looks like tacaros now, because those recipes are just on the internet. But that's really recent, and I think that's kind of interesting.
That just made me think about something I like about Lucy Rhee, is the fact that she was never precious about glaze recipes, even though, you know, she specialised in electric kiln glazes and invented a whole palette that was suitable for the electric kiln. And she freely shared them, even though it had taken her decades and decades to come up with, all except for one, because she said it had taken her too long to create.
Thank you for listening to Out of the Kiln from Technique to Concept. This talk was presented in partnership with Crafts, the Crafts Council biannual magazine, and was edited by Shivani Dave.